For this lesson, we'll fly two holding patterns. In the first scenario, we're inbound to the St. Paul downtown airport. A thunderstorm has parked itself over the airport, but it should clear within about 30 minutes. ATC gives us a holding clearance to wait it out. We'll hold west of the Darwin VOR on Victor 78 with an expect further clearance time of 30 minutes from now. Let's join the flight in progress about 10 miles west of the Darwin VOR. So we're headed into St. Paul, Minnesota, and we're about 10 miles from the Darwin VOR. ATC's just given us a holding clearance at the Darwin VOR. We're supposed to hold west of the VOR on the airway that we're currently on, Victor 78. No other information was specified, so we know that it's right turns and 1 minute legs. ATC's not trying to make anything difficult on us here, it's just a simple direct entry. If this were the real world, I'd probably request 4 or 5 mile legs. That'd be a little bit easier, a little less workload, and we'd probably get it. But for the practice here, let's stick to the 1 minute legs in the clearance. We've got a fairly strong wind aloft out of the southeast here. You can see my wind correction. You can see it on the heading indicator, my heading relative to where the bug is. And you can see that that's working because the track and desired track are lined up here. So we're going to have some work to do with wind correction as we go around this hold. One thing that you want to try to do is, if you have time to be established on the inbound course like this, is get a good sense of what the wind correction is on that segment, because it should be the same every time you're inbound, and the rule of thumb for the outbound is to double to triple that. So right now here I can see that I've got 10 degrees or so of wind correction in. That means double to triple on the outbound. It's 20 to 30 degrees. And in fact, we're going to be closer to the triple part of that here because we've got a tailwind on the outbound also, which means we have less time to establish that offset that we need to account for a wider turning radius coming back. So something like 30 degrees of wind correction on the outbound is what we're going to plan for. And we'll have a pretty decent tailwind component as we go out too. So we want to fly a shorter outbound leg to make the inbound be 1 minute. And the winds aloft are at about 25 knots. I'm going to try my first time around. We're going to go with 30 seconds on the outbound. And that might seem like a big correction. I'm going about half the distance that I normally would if there was no wind. But most people tend to underestimate the effect of the wind. Remember, it's not just the outbound that you're correcting for. You're also correcting for the inbound. And you're correcting for the turns. The turn back inbound is affected by the wind too. So it's usually a pretty significant amount of adjustment that's needed for headwind and tailwind components. But really the first time around we take our best guess and then we make adjustments after that. ATC is not going to care if our inbound leg is 1 minute and 20 seconds or if it's 45 seconds. But in the interest of flying precisely, we'll try to make it as close to 1 minute as we can, and with each lap we'll fine tune it. So we're within 3 minutes to our holding fix here, which means we're able to slow down. And I'm going to slow to 90 knots, bring the power back to 2100 RPM. Let the airplane slow down. There's no reason to go fast and burn a lot of fuel in the holding pattern. If I had more time and I wanted to slow down early, I'd just ask ATC. They'd probably be fine with that. The other thing I need to do is make sure the GPS is set up for this. So right now, I'm going to Darwin, but I'm still in the flight plan. And so when we get there, it's going to transfer on to the Gopher VOR, which we don't want. So I'm going to put it in OBS mode. We can do that as early as we want. And tweak this just a little to recenter the needle. Now the sequencing has stopped. It won't go on after Darwin, and when I want it to, I'll just take it back out of OBS mode. And as we fly the hold, I'm going to keep the heading bug on the inbound course. That helps me visualize as we go around what leg we're on and what wind correction we have in at the moment. It's easy when you're doing multiple laps to lose track momentarily of where exactly you are in the holding pattern. Alright, and my preference here is going to be to put up the map view and zoom it in. This gives me a nice depiction of where my inbound course is, and I can kind of see the holding pattern as we go here. And of course I've got it on ForeFlight as well. I've got the course to Darwin. So we're going to get a to-from flip here in just a second, and that's when we'll start our turn. There's the arriving waypoint enunciation. And there's the flip. So here we go, turning to the outbound. Now we're also technically required to inform ATC when we reach the hold, so I would make a call to Minneapolis approach here and tell them that we're establishing the hold at the Darwin VOR at 5,000 feet. So I'm turning to the outbound heading here. I'm going to roll into my wind correction right away. And normally we would start our time as soon as the from indication flips back to 2. That's probably going to happen while we're still turning here because of the way the wind is helping us. And in that case, I'm just going to wait until we actually get rolled level to start the timer again. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here. And the way I'm doing this, and we haven't had a flip yet, the way I'm doing this, though, there's the flip. Timer starts. We're going to go for 30 seconds. And the way I'm visualizing this heading is I'm looking at the bottom of the heading indicator, and I'm seeing that my heading is about 30 degrees offset from the heading bug. So without having to do any math, I can look at that and visualize where I am and what kind of heading I'm using. And just looking at the GPS ground track here on the moving map, it looks like I should be producing more offset than I am. I probably don't have enough wind correction in. But let's hold the heading here and see how this turns out. There's 30 seconds. That came up fast. Now we're turning back. We're verifying that we have the inbound course still twisted into the GPS. And we'll see how this wind correction worked out the first time around. So we'll judge our left-right correction on the outbound based on whether we roll out right on the inbound or whether we come up left or right of it. And we'll start a timer then when we're wings level, and that'll be our basis for judging our outbound timing. And I can already tell that this isn't going to work laterally because we're clearly from the GPS going to go through the inbound course. And that's okay. There is protected airspace on the other side, so I'm not going to steepen the bank. I'm just going to turn a little bit past and establish an intercept heading and go from there and make an adjustment the next time around. So I'll go all the way to a 120 heading and see if that gets us back in time. Go a little bit past that. I'm looking at the map and seeing that it might take a little more. Let's start the timer again. So even with about 30 degrees of wind correction on the outbound, it's going to take more than that. And part of the reason there, probably pretty much all the reason there, is the strong tailwind component in addition to the crosswind component. We need to kind of cover more ground laterally in less time, so we need more offset, more wind correction. All right, needle's coming back in. And my timing looks like it's going to be fairly accurate here, but with that little deviation there off course, it's hard to say exactly if that was correct or not. But we'll try it again on the outbound and see how it works. So here we should get a flip. There it is. Now we're turning, and I'm going to try a full 40 degrees of wind correction here. Alright, so right about here we'll try this time. And we're waiting for a flip to the 2. There it is right away. Timer goes again. We'll try 30 seconds again, and we'll just hold this heading and see how this works out. If you ever were to find yourself disoriented as you go around the hold, just go direct to the holding fix and start over from there. So you can see from the moving map now that we are actually establishing some offset, that we're not just paralleling the inbound course. And that'll be necessary because of the wider turning radius as we turn in a downwind direction. So we'll see how this works out. Alright, there's 30 again. Here comes the turn. And it's looking better, but it's looking like it's still not enough. We're still going to cross right here and need to make an adjustment back. Not as much, though. Alright, timer. Overshoot a little bit to get ourselves back on. And we'll try in lap 3 and see if we can get it right. Okay, there's our flip. Alright, so a pretty dramatic wind correction angle here. We'll see how this works. There's our flip back to 2. Timer's running. Go for 30 seconds. The more correction I put in here, the more time I might actually need to end up flying outbound because we're not flying as directly outbound anymore, but we'll stick with 30 seconds for now. And this looks pretty good. We're still going to cross through it a little bit, but we're pretty close to right on target here. Let's see how our timing works out. Again, I'm rolling past the heading bug to put in that wind correction angle. Start the timer. Pretty happy with that. Just a little bit left of course here, but pretty close. Now let's say we're going to leave the hold here. We're only 0.2 miles away, so we'll have to take it out of OBS mode right now. It preserves our course, and we're hitting it right at a minute. So that last lap was pretty much spot on. And now it's transferring us onto the next leg, 084, to the Gopher VOR, and we'll continue on into St. Paul. Well, this is our flight path here, and you can see that we made adjustments to progressively get closer and closer to the ideal holding pattern. And you can also see that it's not shaped like a standard racetrack, and that's on purpose. That's what it looks like when you have wind like this. In this case, the wind was pretty strong out of the southeast. Our first lap was an underestimation of how much the wind would affect us laterally. So our first lap is the one that is the closest here. We actually also crossed the VOR just slightly north of the actual VOR, which didn't help. But the wind correction that I had put in here was only enough to just a little bit, just offset a little bit, almost just parallel. And you can see how wide our turning radius is coming back with the tailwind component throughout the turn. And so we crossed through the inbound course onto the non-holding side. That's okay, as long as we don't go way on that side. There is protected airspace over there. So we made our adjustment, re-intercepted the inbound course. Take two, we put in a little bit more correction. That's this lap here. Still only went out for 30 seconds, and we established more of an offset, but it still wasn't quite enough. So we went through the inbound course again, but not by very much, made our adjustment, got back on, and then on lap 3 we finally had enough wind correction. So here's lap 3. You can see a significant offset, and it's enough to account for the wind and the wider turning radius coming back here. We roll out pretty close to right on center and hit the VOR at almost exactly a minute, so I'm real happy with the third lap. So that's the way these usually go. You can't be certain what exactly the wind aloft is, so you give it your best guess and you see how it works out. Usually it's not perfect the first time, usually it's a little better the second time, and by a few laps you've got it nailed in. And the reality is, again, that ATC doesn't really care if it's perfect. They're going to be perfectly happy with all 3 laps that we did here because we essentially stayed in one place, which is what they wanted us to do. One of the most common scenarios for holding in GA aircraft occurs when more than one aircraft is departing or arriving simultaneously at a non-towered airport. Only one can use the airspace at a time, so the other has to hold or otherwise be delayed. In this second scenario, we're arriving at the Winona Municipal Airport in Minnesota. Another aircraft has just been released for departure, so we've been instructed to hold at the initial approach fix. We're given an expect further clearance 15 minutes from now, and an expectation that we'll only need to make about 1 lap in the hold. So we're headed to Aliu for the GPS approach into Winona, and we've been given an instruction to hold at Aliu with an expectation of probably just one lap or so in the hold until departing traffic gets out of the way. So we've got the approach loaded in the GPS. That has the holding pattern in it, so the GPS is going to make it real easy to enter and fly this holding pattern. Just a little bit of button pushing to do to make it all happen. We've got a pretty strong wind out of the north here. You can see that our ground speed's 142 knots, which is about 20 knots faster than what our true airspeed is here. So probably a little over 20 knots of wind. And I can see, just visualizing on my chart here with the holding pattern and where the airplane is, I can see at a glance that this is going to be a parallel entry. The GPS will tell us that, but it's good to know, to be able to know what it is before the GPS tells you that. And my suggestion for learning what entry is appropriate for a given holding pattern is just to look at a bunch of them. You know, draw your airplane, draw the holding pattern, and figure out what entry is appropriate. Pull out a bunch of approach procedures and look at the missed approach procedures and determine what entry is right. And once you've looked at a bunch of holding patterns in context, it'll become intuitive which entry is appropriate if you understand how the entries work. You know, in this case, we clearly have to turn around, so it's not a direct entry, and we're just in a much more efficient position to turn to parallel the inbound leg rather than to turn an additional 30 degrees for a teardrop entry. And I've got a heading dialed in here which is tracking me to the waypoint. So I'm going to switch the GPS over to the map page. That'll give me a nice picture of the holding pattern. And I can zoom in here. I can even see when the turn anticipation is coming up with the dotted magenta line. Alright, so hold parallel is indeed what it's giving us. And in just a second it'll tell us what heading to turn to. So 120 is the heading in 10 seconds. I'm going to put the bug on 301, the inbound course. And here we go to 120. Now if I just turn to 120, the wind is going to push me pretty far south. If I had an autopilot flying this, it would track 120. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do too. The AIM says you can just fly the heading, and that's perfectly fine. But if you have access to track, it would seem to be appropriate to use it so we don't get blown well south of the holding pattern. I'm going to go to 110 for the heading, and I can see at a glance here that that looks pretty good on the GPS itself, just on the moving map that's showing the track. Let's start the timer just out of habit here. So I'm going to hold this heading. Now the guidance that the GPS is giving me throughout the hold is relative to the inbound course, and you can see that based on the desired track of 301. I'll twist the OBS to that, but that's why I put my heading bug on that heading as well. It's a good reminder. And the GPS is going to take me out the full 4 miles of the holding pattern. I don't have to do that though, which is why I'm in the habit of starting the timer here. If we were doing the approach and going straight in after this, I probably would only go out a minute or so and then turn back. There's no reason to fly an extra 4 miles out of the way here in something like a 172 that takes a couple minutes to go 4 miles. But in this case, we're just holding. We're not in any hurry, so I'll let it guide us around the hold and go out until it tells us to turn. Alright, so 256 is coming up in 7 seconds now. That's a 45-degree intercept to the inbound course. Here comes the turn. So one thing that we have to remember to do here is to stop the GPS from sequencing. Because if I do nothing here, it's going to sequence us right through the approach. After Leo, it's going to go to Wabney, the next waypoint. And so to do that, all I have to do is press the OBS button. Now we're in suspend, and it won't sequence anymore. But when I want it to sequence, I just press OBS and take it out of suspend. Using the heading bug to visualize the inbound course here, I can see we're passing through the heading of the inbound course, and we're continuing until we've established a 45-degree intercept towards it. I'm going to go a little bit less than 45 degrees because of that wind out of the north here. This looks just fine. Another valid way to fly this parallel entry would be to just go direct Aliu again from here if we wanted. But re-intercepting keeps us from having to do any extra button pushing, and it gives us a good chance to be established on the inbound course for a while here. Cross directly over the waypoint on track, and have a chance to figure out what the wind correction is on the inbound. Okay, here comes a turn to 121. Now if we just turn to 121, that would be no wind correction, and after 4 miles we would be way too close to the inbound course. So I am going to put in some correction towards the north wind, so to the left. Not as much as I would if it were a 1-minute legs hold, because going out a full 4 miles, if we put in too much wind correction, we get offset by too much. But it was about 10 degrees on the inbound leg or so, so I'm going to go just a little more than 10 degrees on the outbound and monitor the progress on the moving map as we go. Let's actually try about 105 for the heading. We don't have any timer to run here because we're just going to go for 4 miles, or really until the GPS tells us to turn back. And the GPS doesn't know what the wind is doing, so it's not going to give us headings. It doesn't know headings either, but it's not going to account for the wind. It does know our ground speed, so it can do turn anticipation that way. But in a holding pattern where your heading is constantly changing, you still have to put in a little bit of manual work to get some of the wind corrections right, like on the outbound here. Some GPS units actually do have heading and airspeed inputs, and in those cases they can fly perfect holds even in strong winds all on their own. And I've increased my wind correction angle a little bit just by looking at the moving map and knowing that we want to get a little bit outside of what it thinks our normal turning radius would be here, since we're turning in a downwind direction, or a little bit north of where the magenta line is would be ideal. And here comes the turn in 10 seconds to 301. And this looks like it should work out pretty well. We'll turn through that heading a little bit because we've got wind out of the north. Yeah, so that worked out pretty much perfectly, needle centered right as we get there. We'll go right to our wind corrected heading. And normally we'd start a timer here if this was a timed hold, but it's not. So let's say ATC cleared us here for the rest of the approach. All we have to do is press the OBS button. The only thing that changes on the GPS is the suspend indication. But now, after reaching Aliu, it'll transfer on to our next waypoint. Holds in the real world are rare and simple with modern equipment. Even so, building random holds, suspending sequencing, and using the information provided by modern equipment are skills you must have.